أعوذ بالله تعالى من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين، حبيب قلوبنا وعظيم نفوسنا أبا القاسم محمد. الصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين، وعلى أصحابه الغر الميامين. الحمد لله الذي جعلنا من المتمسكين بولاية سيدي ومولاي علي بن أبي طالب. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه المجيد: وخلقناكم أزواجا. صدق الله العظيم. And Surah An-Naba, Surah 78 in the Quran, verse 8, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about creating the human beings in pairs. We will continue the part 2 of marriage in Islam in this series today. Dearest brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to part 5 of Marriage in Islam. Here's a quick recap of the previous lectures where we explored the concept of polygamy in Judeo-Christianity, explored the many wives of the prophets, and especially the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the goals of his marriages of social reform of the community and ensuring the survival of Islam through his strategic alliances. However, I must assert the fact that by no means this is an exhaustive list. Different books have mentioned different potential wives and different stories and different lineages, but I did not find strong conclusive evidence to include them in this series. In today's lecture, we will focus on the Prophet Muhammad's marriage to Sayyidah Khadija and the lessons that we could learn from their marriage to solve some of the contemporary issues we are facing today in our society. The first wife of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was Sayyidah Khadija, and during their marriage, he never married any other women. When we examine the historical records and look at the biographical works by Muslims and non-Muslim authors, we find that no respectable, reliable author have ever mentioned even the possibility of the Holy Prophet considering marrying any other woman during the life of Sayyidah Khadija. All his other wives came after the demise of Lady Khadija. And I must mention that all the wives of the prophets, in all of them, Sayyidah Khadija has a very special and the highest status in Islam, because according to a hadith that we have about the Prophet, he says that there are 4 ladies are among the women of paradise. First is Khadija bint Khuwailid, second Fatima bint Muhammad, then Maryam bint Imran, and last Asiya bint Mazahim, who is the wife of the Pharaoh. The first lesson in terms of Sunnah of Rasulullah and his marriage to Sayyidah Khadija is monogamy. Polygamy is the exception to the rule, not the rule, and the Holy Prophet's marriage to Sayyidah Khadija proves that. The Prophet married Sayyidah Khadija at the age of 24 or 25. We have different narrations about his age. And she passed away when he turned about 50 years of age. So he spent anywhere from 25 to 26 years of his life being married monogamously to one woman. In fact, when she passed away, he declared that year to be Aam al-Huzn, or the year of the sorrow. From age 50 onwards to age 63, when he passed away, he had married all the other wives. Another important question to ponder over is, did Islam introduce the concept of polygamy in order to garner support? As did they want early converts to join the religion of Islam if they were given the privilege of being able to be married to more than one woman at the same time? And the answer is not at all. When Islam was introduced in the world in the 7th century of the Common Era, it inherited the existing marriage system in pre-Islamic Arabia, which included polygamy and temporary marriages of mut'ah. Islam refined, modified, and reformed the system in existence at the time by doing the following. First of all, Islam put a limit to the numbers of wives that a person can have at one time. Maximum of 4 wives. Based on what we have explored only in this lecture series, we can see that for thousands of years before Islam, men engaged in polygamy, and there was almost a limitless number of women that men can be engaged in polygamy with in terms of either marriage or concubine, and Islam put a cap on it. Secondly, Islam put very stringent conditions on a person who wanted to marry a second wife. He must be able to provide, maintain the family, etc., etc. And the main and the most important thing is to deal with both on the basis of justice and fairness. In chapter 4, Surah An-Nisa, verse 3, after allowing the Muslim men to marry 2, 3, or 4 wives, the Quran immediately says, "But if you fear that you will not do justice between them, then marry only one." Looking at the psychology of the human being, especially the male, we can say that only very few exceptional people might have the quality for that kind of justice and fairness. It's almost an impossible situation to comply with. There is also the question of ayats being, or these ayats being with the nasikh and mansukh, which is a completely different discussion, but I still wanted to mention it nonetheless. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولن تستطيعوا أن تعدلوا بين النساء ولو حرصتم فلا تميلوا كل الميل فتذروها كالمعلقة وإن تصلحوا وتتقوا فإن الله كان غفورا رحيما. صدق الله العظيم. In the same surah, Surah An-Nisa, Surah 4, verse 129, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And you do not have the ability to do justice between the wives, even though you may wish to do so." Thus, that is not my personal opinion. However, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that doing justice between more than one wife and treating them equally is almost an impossible situation, even though a person might want to do it. The point really worth mentioning here is that the large majority of the Islamic world has blatantly chosen to disregard the conditions and the responsibility that comes with taking on another wife, and has turned it into a joke. The abuse of this very delicate and extreme allowance has made Islam and Muslims the subject of ridicule and disrespect in the global society. On the other hand, other religions that prohibit polygamy and divorce is outlawed, and they view marriage as once done, it's forever, often create impossible situations for their followers. Such rigid rules often lead those people to commit adultery and have mistresses, and the destruction of families and their societies. We know that Sayyidah Khadija was a very wealthy woman when she married the Holy Prophet. She was known as Amirat Quraysh, or the Princess of Quraysh. There are many accounts who affirm that she was by far the richest woman in Arabia. If we calculated her net worth at the time of her marriage, it would most definitely exceeded her husband significantly. In an interesting study that was published in the Times, I read an article that said that men's self-esteem can take a beating if their wives do well. And this is talking about 2013 and Western society. In our societies, especially in our Indo-Pak communities today, we hear about the challenges of our generation in finding potential spouses. The more successful the female is, the harder it is for her to find a good match. Based on my own personal conversations with individuals and trusted first-hand accounts, parents in our communities want to educate their daughters. However, they don't want to over-educate them, because they find that when the girl is highly educated, it becomes a challenge finding her a spouse. They fear that either the suitor will be a grasping opportunist who's only marrying the daughter for money, or eventually his ego will have problems with her success and they would end up divorced. So I must emphasize that 1400 years ago, in a patriarchal society, that was dominated by male chauvinistic men, the Holy Prophet was able to rise above the ego problem and marry a more successful woman, and his ego had no issues. If we want to teach our children something about the Prophet, especially our boys, we must teach him about this. So we know that Sayyidah Khadija was very affluent, and she accumulated her wealth by building her own business. She was a successful entrepreneur before her marriage, and she continued to work in her business after her marriage. In fact, the Prophet had worked for her as an agent before he married her. There is no evidence in the annals of history that show that Lady Khadija gave up her work because she married the Prophet. Nor did the Prophet take over the mantle of leadership of her enterprise just because he became her husband. There is no evidence that he ever asked her to quit or give up her work because his pride could not accept his wife earning a living. When we see women being forbidden to work after marriage in our societies, it is due to their husbands and their husbands' families' pride and ego. That is culture, not religion. I want to emphasize this point. Sunnat Rasulullah shows that Rasulullah supported his wife's passion for her enterprise. It did not forbid her or make her feel ashamed for continuing on working after being married. I found this interesting study done in 2014 where they took a random sample of over 31,000 couples, and they were looking at the age disparity between couples, and they found that 64% of the time the man was older, and 23% of the couples the woman was older, and the remaining 13% the partners were less than 12 months apart. And this was interesting because when we look at the ages of the Prophet Muhammad and Sayyidah Khadija when they got married, we see the Prophet being either 24 or 25 years of age, and Sayyidah Khadija actually was either 25 or 26 years of age. I know there are many false sources out there saying that she was around 40 years of age, which we Ahl Tashir don't believe in that. And based on the references that I have in the end, it proves that she was actually between the ages of 25 and 26. So they, as a couple, they were in the either the 13% or the 23% that we have here today. And that is a very important point in the sense that 1400 years ago, in the days of Jahiliyyah, the Holy Prophet made a big statement about marriage by marrying someone who was slightly older than him. Even today in our communities, if the man is about 10 years older than the female, people don't blink an eye. And if the female is older than by 10 minutes, she becomes as an unacceptable potential spouse. And this is such an important fact, and I want to emphasize it mostly because due to the cultural preconceived ideas that we have, we are really living in the age of Jahiliyyah by following those cultural beliefs and not progressing with Islam. And so many couples are left struggling. So many individuals, young individuals, are having difficulties finding potential spouses because the families insist on having significantly younger brides. And on the flip side, women are cornered into lying about their age and pretending to be younger than they are, because they want to be considered as a prospect. It only goes to show that when we don't follow the true path of Islam and the Sunnah of Rasulullah, we create problems for ourselves and our communities. Without a doubt, the Prophet's marriage to Sayyidah Khadija was the perfect example of marital bliss. They had a life of harmony. Theirs was a relationship based on respect, love, and partnership. The Muslim communities might not have the high divorce rates of other communities today, but by no means the contentment in marriage rate would be any higher. In many marriages, especially in our culture, the wife's role is not one of a partner, but the role of a subservient who will listen, to and obey her husband and his family. She is there to take care of them, the husband, the children, the in-laws, and she's not considered as a confidant or an equal. Again, that goes to show that when we deviate from the teachings of Islam and the Sunnah of Rasulullah, we create problems for ourselves and our families and our communities. When the Holy Prophet married Sayyidah Khadija, she came to the Prophet as a virgin with no prior husbands. The stories of her being a widow are false, and she had no children from previous relationships. The two female children attributed to her from a previous marriage were actually the daughters of her sister who had passed away, and actually Rasulullah and Lady Khadija decided to adopt them together. In their marriage, when they started thinking about starting a family, we all know that they were faced by a lot of difficulties and challenges. And in Surah Al-Kawthar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even kind of reveals about how the kuffar of Makkah were insulting the Prophet and demeaning him and psychologically abusing him, and they had no regard for his sense of loss and his wife's loss and their grief that they were suffering from. And the point I really want to emphasize here today is the Prophet could have married any other woman or multiple women in his lifetime with Sayyidah Khadija while she was alive for the purpose of having children, because, you know, they were having difficulty with having children live past their infancy. We know that they had two children together, Al-Qasim, and there's another name, Tahir or Mutahhar, that we know that were born to Sayyidah Khadija. However, they did not survive for too long, and their deaths were a big blow to both of them. However, we see that the Prophet's high moral character, his akhlaq, and his love and respect for his wife prevented him from taking on another wife. Although the precedent was there, he could easily would have taken another wife and justified it that he wanted to have children with her. But he did not. So when the Muslims around the world use the excuse of following Sunnat Rasulullah and taking another wife for the sake of having other children, it's the biggest fallacy and hypocrisy in the Islamic world, because the Holy Prophet never did so. He never married another woman to have children. All the wives that he did marry had different purposes, but children was never a purpose for taking on another wife. I pray that you found today's session informative and engaging. Here are all the references for this session's information, and inshallah we will continue on the next session, part 6, tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.